everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, filling in for Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. Since taking office in January 2017, President Donald Trump has tried to deliver on his campaign promise to radically reorient American foreign policy, with limited success. Trump has touted his vision of putting America first, as opposed to the historical American foreign policy consensus of global leadership based on enlightened self-interest. Over the past 3.5 years, he has withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the multilateral nuclear deal with Iran, among others, while criticizing America's European and Asian allies as free riders and launching trade wars with allies and adversaries alike. Nevertheless, the system of alliances that underpin America's global leadership role has remained intact, and in many ways, the foundations of American foreign policy have withstood Trump's efforts to fundamentally remake them. But if there is one area where Trump has had a clear and consistent impact, it is on American diplomacy. A wave of high-profile departures has depleted the State Department, even as the Trump administration's chaotic policy process has created uncertainty and confusion for both partners and adversaries. And Trump's transactional and self-interested approach to foreign policy has undermined ties with America's closest allies and partners. Joining us to discuss the damage that Trump has done to American diplomacy and how to repair it is William J. Burns. Ambassador Burns is currently the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Secretary of State from 2011 to 2014, culminating a 33-year diplomatic career during which he also served as Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Ambassador to Russia, among many other senior positions in Washington and abroad. Just as a heads up, we apologize for the sound quality of Ambassador Burns' audio. We did have some technical difficulties during the recording. We hope it doesn't interfere too much with the interview, which is well worth a close listen. Ambassador Burns, welcome to Trendlines, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
So the topic we'll be discussing is the damage that Donald Trump has done to U.S. diplomacy. And I thought that there's been a lot of discussion of some of the big picture strategic issues and orientation of American foreign policy. And we'll get to that in the course of the interview. But what I'd like to start with is institutions and process, because I think that given your career as a practitioner of U.S. diplomacy, you might be able to help people understand exactly what that impact has been. So beginning with the institution of the State Department, in a recent article for Foreign Affairs, you wrote about the personnel attrition, the overwhelming number of political appointees rather than career diplomats in key positions, vacancies among U.S. ambassadorships. What impact does that have on the conduct of U.S. diplomacy? What kind of skill sets are missing, are depleted, and how does that impact the diplomacy, the conduct of diplomacy on the ground, but also in Washington?
Sure. Well, thanks again, Judah. I think the first thing for Americans to understand is that we are operating on an international landscape today beyond the Cold War. That's challenging for the United States in lots of different ways. We're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block anymore with the rise of China. And there's also a rise of problems without passports. All of those challenges like climate change, like the pandemic that the United States and so many other countries around the world are struggling through right now, the revolution in technology, all of which demand a form of cooperation, notwithstanding the competition that's going to go on between the United States and China and the United States and other countries as well. And I say all that because I think we're living through a moment in which diplomacy as a tool of promoting American interests in that very complicated world is even more important than ever. And yet, over the 3.5 decades that I served as a professional diplomat, I've never never seen a moment when it's been more adrift, when our institutions, in particular the State Department, are more in danger of being hollowed out by a White House whose view of that landscape is that American power is best served unilaterally. That's dismissive of alliances and that's dismissive of institutions like the State Department and like diplomacy as well, at precisely the moment when I think they matter more than ever. So that's what's at stake now, I think, is an intersection of that incredibly complicated moment on the international landscape and an American leadership which is pointed in almost the opposite direction from what I think American interests involve.
Now, with regard to the actual the institutional hollowing out of the State Department, how easy will it be to repair that in the aftermath of a Trump administration, assuming that there's a change in leadership in November? Is it easy to reinstall the people who have left under a future administration? Or is this a permanent loss of expertise and institutional memory at the State Department at this point?
I think a lot of the corrosion that we've seen take place over the last 3.5 years, and in fairness, as part of a drift in American diplomacy for decades before that, a lot of that corrosion is going to be very hard to erase anytime soon. It's going to take a lot longer to fix the institutions of American diplomacy than it's taken to break them. And I would add that it's not as if all of that drift was invented by Donald Trump. For decades before President Trump was elected, you'd seen a tendency to treat diplomacy, sometimes at least, as a kind of under-resourced afterthought. The federal budget for the State Department, for the Agency for International Development, was cut by about 50%, 50, between 1985 and the year 2000. As the Cold War was ending, it was natural for Americans to look to what is in effect nation building at home and dealing with all the deep structural problems that we face at home. But there was that drift in the focus on institutions of diplomacy. And then, of course, came the huge jolt to our system that 9/11 represented, and an almost understandable tendency to emphasize even more military and intelligence tools and invest less in diplomacy. But if that drift had been going on for a while before President Trump was elected, he certainly accelerated it, in my view, and made it significantly worse with the sidelining of career expertise. I mean, just if you look at one statistic today, there are 28 assistant secretary of state positions in the State Department. These are the senior jobs around which the United States organizes its approach to foreign policy and implements it. Of those 28 senior assistant secretary of state positions, only one today is held by a career officer confirmed by the U.S. Senate. That's a proportion unseen in modern American diplomatic history. You have a higher percentage of political appointees as U.S. ambassadors overseas than any time in modern American diplomatic history. And largely as a result of the hollowing out of this administration, you have a dramatic drop in the number of Americans, both young and a little bit older, who are applying to join the U.S. Foreign Service, a drop of something like 40% over the last few years. Those all create structural problems which take a long time. In fact, I think it'll take a generation to reverse and to fix.
And in the meantime, in terms of the diplomatic tradecraft, how does that show up in terms of communicating with foreign governments, in terms of the kind of inputs that the State Department can make to policy discussions in Washington? Is it the sort of thing that is a severe handicap? Is it debilitating? Is it the sort of thing where workarounds can be found?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to find effective workarounds at a time when you have a White House, at least, which is dismissive and disdainful, I think, of career expertise, which with its accusations that, all of those people who serve from one administration to another serve, loyally to the best of their ability, both Republican and Democratic administrations, are somehow seen as a deep state, as suspect. And what happens, I think, is that if you're a foreign government and you see these realities in Washington, what incentive do you have to pay attention to career diplomats in an embassy overseas when it's crystal clear as a result of the latest tweet that their advice, that their expertise is not given much credence in the White House? And so it creates a real dysfunction, I think, in the way in which we operate in the world and the way in which we pursue American interests on a very complicated international landscape.
Turning a moment toward process, I think especially the impeachment proceeding really shined a light on the dysfunctional process in terms of policymaking under the Trump administration. This idea of a personalized foreign policy, politicized, with parallel tracks of diplomacy, a lack of any visible interagency process, and then again, what you mentioned, the ad hoc and unstable nature of it, where a post on Twitter can basically undo months of work. What effect does that have beyond the obvious ones when you're a U.S. diplomat trying to advance America's interests? How does that affect your day-to-day function and what you can get done?
Well, it makes it a lot more complicated because you're not going to be taken as seriously as you ought to be by foreign governments or people in foreign societies because they're going to doubt whether or not you're speaking, in effect, for an elected political leadership in Washington. I think, there were a number of aspects of, the Ukraine episode that you just described, which were deeply disturbing. First and foremost was the politicization of diplomacy. What Fiona Hill, the former senior National Security Council staff person, responsible for Russia for Europe, said was, basically using diplomacy to pursue what she termed domestic political errands. That's something that's not only deeply wrong, but it's deeply corrosive to American interests in a very complicated, vulnerable society like Ukraine. I mean, why should a Ukrainian leadership, the people of Ukrainian society, pay attention to what the United States says about the need to fight corruption, for example, when, we're, in a sense, mirroring those same kind of practices, the same kind of politicization of the pursuit of the national interest that, for years and years we've criticized in other countries. And so what happens in a place like Ukraine is that we're actually just helping to make that society even more vulnerable to manipulation by big, ambitious, autocratic neighbors like Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Do you get the sense that the State Department, besides the senior leadership, is actually playing a role in the formation of U.S. foreign policy today in terms of informing and implementing policy?
Yeah, I think Secretary Pompeo clearly has a close personal and political relationship with President Trump. And so, in that sense, I think he probably has, as strong a relationship as anybody in the current cabinet. I'm not sure that translates across the board in the State Department, simply because it's an institution that's been so badly hollowed out, where there's such disdain, as I mentioned before, in the White House for career expertise as well. So it strikes me that there's a pretty big disconnect sometimes between that close connection at the very top and the effectiveness of, diplomats in the field.
And looking back at previous administrations, obviously there have been examples in the past where administrations have found their own way of shaping and even distorting the policy process to their own ends. So in that sense, the Trump administration is doing it in its own way. What's unique about the way the Trump administration is doing it and about the damage that that's doing to U.S. diplomacy?
Well, it's a really good question, Judah, and I think it has everything to do, as you suggested, with the way in which this is done. You look at some specific instances, the pushback in this administration against predatory trade and investment practices by the Chinese leadership, in many ways is long overdue. But how you go about doing that, going about that in a kind of blunt, blustery, unilateralist way, dismissing the notion that you should make common cause with allies and partners who share some of those same concerns, whether it's Japan or the European Union, that's been pushed to the side. So instead of making common cause with those countries and multiplying the influence that we have over Chinese practices, we pursue this unilaterally, and we start second and third front trade or tariff conflicts with the European Union, with Japan, over other issues. So how we go about doing this, pursuing those interests on a very complicated and fast-changing international landscape, is really important. And I think it's that unilateralist obsession of this administration, which is so counterproductive and runs so counter to where I think American diplomacy at its best would point. You see this in other instances too. I mean, I think the Trump administration has been right to push some of our European allies, some of our partners in NATO, to invest more in common defense than they have in the past. President Trump's not the first U.S. president to push in that direction. But how we go about doing that makes a big difference. If you go about doing it from the premise that alliances really don't matter so much, and creating real doubts in the minds of some of our closest European allies about our reliability, that hardly offers them much incentive. It doesn't push them constructively in the direction of investing more in our collective defense.
Well, we've already jumped a little bit into the strategic orientation part of the conversation. So let me follow up by asking you, again, it's a hypothetical, and a lot about Trump's temperament and character makes it almost a fantastical hypothetical. But imagine a President Trump in January 2017 who convenes an interagency process, and he says, listen, I know very few of you agree with me and with my agenda, yet it's the agenda that I've been elected to implement by the American people. I know we've asked our allies to pay more on defense. I want them to start doing it. I know that we've had a lot of goals to maybe draw back the U.S. in terms of military footprint abroad. I want to start doing it. How could a president elected to effect a radical change have enlisted U.S. diplomatic tools more effectively to do so?
Well, I think actually made effective use of those tools as well. The objectives that you laid out, are ones which a lot of Americans, I think, rightly support, to shift the terms of our engagement in a really complicated part of the world like the Middle East, to end American involvement in military conflicts. A step that's long overdue, I think, whether it's in Afghanistan or was in Iraq. But then to have enough trust in the professionals that any new administration inherits to provide a clear sense of direction, but then to listen a little bit, to their own advice based on their own experience, for better or worse. And how do you mobilize other countries around those same goals? In Afghanistan, for example, I think President Trump's instinct to wind down direct American military involvement there is also long overdue. It's hard to sustain that military involvement. In fact, it doesn't make sense to after nearly 2 decades of war. But how you go about doing this does matter a lot, not just in dealing with the parties in Afghanistan, but engaging with Afghanistan's neighbors, all of whom, to one degree or another, share a cold-blooded interest in insecurity and instability in Afghanistan not spilling outside its borders. That's the essence of what smart diplomacy ought to be about. So it's how you go about doing things that I think matters enormously, especially at this moment on the international landscape, and where the Trump administration has made some of its sharpest departures has been away from the notion of enlightened self-interest, which in my experience animated American foreign policy, American diplomacy at its best. In other words, the notion that, of course, any country is going to want to promote its own interests, the interests of its people, their security, their health, their prosperity, first and foremost. But enlightened in the sense that you want to try to make common cause with other countries around the world who share broadly those same kinds of interests. Instead, I think what President Trump and his administration have done is turned that notion of enlightened self-interest on its head, so that it's all about the self part and very little about the enlightened part. And I think that's precisely the wrong prescription for this moment on the world stage.
Now, at the same time, one of the biggest impacts that Trump has had despite his grandiose declarations, is that he's introduced a huge amount of uncertainty and doubt about U.S. foreign policy and dependability among allies, but also among adversaries. How does that affect U.S. diplomacy in terms of trying to generate the kinds of coalitions you're talking about for some of these very complicated and intricate foreign policy challenges?
That does very practical damage, I think, to our reliability. And I'd be the last person to suggest that we had a pristine record on that over the 35 years that I was a professional diplomat. We made more than our share of mistakes during that period as well. But at least there was a sense on the part of both our allies and our partners, as well as our rivals and our adversaries, that from administration to administration, that commitments made in a prior administration would be, upheld in a new administration, or if there was going to be amendments that inevitably have to be made to take into account changing circumstances, that they were going to be made in a straightforward, predictable way as well. So you look at the area of arms control right now, where, the Trump administration is on the verge of burying what's left of the old arms control and non-proliferation architecture in the world, having walked away first from the Iranian nuclear agreement, which, again, wasn't just between the United States and Iran, it was between most of the world community's most significant powers and Iran. Then, most recently, walking away from the Open Skies Agreement, which the U.S. and our NATO allies had first reached with the Soviet Union and with Russia, to allow some greater transparency and monitoring military developments across what used to be the Iron Curtain, and create a little bit greater sense of transparency and predictability. And now you have the New START agreement, which was reached in the Obama administration, which reduced and helps to verify and monitor the strategic nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia, which expires at the beginning of 2021. And right now, there's very little evidence of any interest on the part of the Trump White House in trying to extend that agreement, which is something that's provided for in the treaty. I think if you see a collapse of arms control, that can do huge practical damage to American interests. It can restart arms races at precisely the moment when we can least afford it, when we're dealing with the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression, still wrestling with a terrible pandemic that is affecting almost every society around the world. That's a time when we want to look soberly at the importance of not only preserving smart agreements that really serve our cold-blooded self-interest as well as the self-interest of others, but doing it in a way which is going to deepen, not undermine, our reputation for being reliable in negotiations. Why should another government want to negotiate in good faith with the U.S. administration, with this U.S. administration, if, you can't be certain that, a new administration comes in and is going to overturn everything that was negotiated by its predecessors?
Now, you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal, and obviously the European Union and the three, Germany, the UK, and France, were signatories to the deal. And obviously all had major objections to the U.S. withdrawing, and tried for a time to keep the deal on life support, but really weren't able to do it. And so what about this argument that other countries will complain, but eventually they'll come along, they'll come around? The U.S. is the strongest country on earth, and if we shift everything to a bilateral and transactional level, we'll always get what we want. What does that miss or get wrong about America's power and its interests?
Well, I think several things, it seems to me, Judah, that reflect the ways in which, the international landscape is changing. We, for the first quarter century or so after the end of the Cold War, the United States was indisputably the singular dominant player on the international landscape as well. And so, even if it wasn't always smart to do, we could get our own way on many, if not most, issues, just through the sheer weight of our influence in the world. We've moved clearly in recent years into a different era in which we're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block. And so what that means is that more than at any recent era, this is a time when the United States needs to look to diplomacy, to working with allies and partners to help it to shape the rules of the road internationally and reshape institutions which are desperately in need of reform and renovation in our wider self-interest. In other words, to multiply our influence through allies and coalitions and partnerships. And instead, what I'm afraid we're doing today is dividing our influence. We have a White House that's deeply divisive at home, and we're equally divisive on the international landscape, undermining what ought to be a unique asset for the United States, our ability to invest in alliances, to draw in coalitions of countries. That really is what sets us apart from lonelier powers like China and Russia, which at least up until now, haven't had those assets to draw upon. So that's one thing, just looking at shifts in the balance of power among states in the world. The second, I think, is, to look honestly at the huge existential challenges which are posed by those problems without passports, the huge global challenges that, go beyond the capacity of any one state to deal with. Climate change, most obviously, but also the revolution in technology. How do you maximize the benefits of the revolution in artificial intelligence and biotechnology while minimizing the obvious dislocations as well? How do you prepare to deal more effectively than most of us have been able to deal with this pandemic? How do you prepare for the next pandemic? All of those require a significant degree of international cooperation. Again, not altruistically, not as an abstraction, but in the self-interest of Americans and their health and their security and their prosperity. And so in that sense, I think that unilateralist tendency of the Trump White House, I think, pushes us in exactly the wrong direction on a landscape that more than any time in recent memory actually requires us to balance what's going to be real geopolitical competition with China, for example, with cooperation on a range of other issues.
In the event that he wins re-election in November, what would another 4 years of Donald Trump mean for America's diplomatic relationships and for its global role, concretely?
I think there's a big difference between 4 years of the damage we've seen so far and 8 years. I think if you had a second term of President Trump, I think you have to assume that you're going to see a continuation of the instincts and the blustery unilateralism that you've seen over the course of his first term in office. And I think that's going to do permanent damage to American interests in the world. I think there's a very real prospect that you'll see alliances not just atrophy, but suffer, real permanent damage. I think international institutions, whether it's the institutions connected to the United Nations or regional institutions, which are already, full of flaws and deeply in need of renovation, can start to really falter as well. And I think what happens in that circumstance is that our allies start to hedge and lose faith in us. Our adversaries and our rivals, whether it's China or resurgent but still declining powers over the long term, like Vladimir Putin's Russia, take advantage. And where all of those institutions that we did so much to help shape over the course of the last 3/4 of a century, and which admittedly are deeply in need of renovation, but they all start to wobble and teeter as well. And so then you're left with an international landscape which becomes far more anarchic, I think, than what we've seen before, which creates greater insecurities among states and makes it that much harder for states to work together to deal with those big overarching existential challenges like climate change. So I really worry about how the damage would be magnified to American interests in the international landscape if you're talking about 8 years as opposed to 4 years.
So now turning to the easy part, cleaning up and repairing the damage. Assuming there is a leadership change in 2020, what will that take to repair the damage that Trump has done to U.S. diplomacy and to its relationships with allies, its relationship in terms of international institutions and its global role? What for you are the most urgent priorities that need to be addressed in terms of the damage that's been done?
Well, I mean, I think the first is just to have an honest assessment of the landscape. I think it's a mistake to think that you can simply flick a switch after a change in administrations, if that happens. This year in our presidential elections, that you can just flick a switch and restore, the state of alliances and the state of America's role in the world just as it existed for a decade or two before. I think the world is changing fast. We're going to have to adapt to that. We can afford neither to the illusion of thinking that we could restore everything that existed before Trump, nor can we afford the illusion of retrenchment. In other words, of the notion that you can focus simply on nation building at home and continue the trend in the Trump administration of not paying much attention to alliances. I think what we need to do is to try to reinvent, in a way, America's role in the international landscape. And that does mean reinvesting in alliances and partnerships, but building them in different ways. The transatlantic alliance, which is as important as any to the United States, we're going to have to shift and I think rebalance a little bit the way in which that alliance operates. The United States is going to need to listen a little bit more to our European allies as well. Some of their approaches to challenges like that posed by China are not necessarily going to be perfectly identical to America's approach, but I think there are ways in which they could be strongly complementary as well. And I think Europeans, by the same token, our European allies, are going to need to step up more, not just in terms of what they do for their own defense, for our common defense, but also in their willingness to take initiative as well. I know that's easier said than done at a time when on both sides of the Atlantic we seem to be suffering from political nervous breakdowns right now. So it's a significant challenge. I think we need to invest more in North America, and our relationships with Canada and with Mexico and with America ought to be logically the natural strategic home base for the United States. And instead, especially in the Trump administration, we've managed that rare feat in diplomacy, which is to piss off the Canadians, which I think is deeply unfortunate. We have a lot more to do, I think, to build on what potential it is could be a lot healthier relations with, not just with Canada, but with Mexico as well. And then in Asia, increasingly the geopolitical and geoeconomic center of gravity on the international landscape. We're fortunate in that, at least today, we have a web of partnerships and alliances from India all the way across to our traditional treaty allies in Japan and South Korea. We have a capacity to help shape rules of the road, whether it's on trade or on how we deal with climate challenges or other kinds of challenges across Asia, that should help us to shape the environment into which China rises. It's not as if we have the capacity to block China's rise, but we certainly have the capacity to shape the environment into which China rises. And that means that we have the capacity, if we're smart about this, and take advantage of that web of partnerships and alliances, that we can affect the incentives and the disincentives of the Chinese leadership that's also going to be dealing with, some of the really difficult economic consequences of the pandemic as well.
At the same time, we see, and it started probably even before the 2016 election, and it's been exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic, but this emerging bipartisan tough on China consensus, where even Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate for president, is taking a very hard line in terms of the kind of approach he would take on China. We've seen Trump's hard line, although it's a little chaotic and quixotic. But does that worry you, this idea that there is an emerging consensus that we have to get tough on China and maybe even contain China's rise?
I think the reality is that the competition between the United States and China is going to be as central a challenge as any on the international landscape as far out into the 21st century as I can see for American foreign policy. How you manage that challenge, how you push back in areas where the behavior of this Chinese leadership threatens American interests and the interests of our allies, where we've got to be, I think, quite resolute in looking at those challenges and being quite honest it doesn't make any sense for the United States, I think, to check our values at the door and expressing those kind of concerns. But when I say manage competition, we also have to keep in mind those areas in which, whether we like it or not, our interests are deeply entangled. That's certainly true with regard to climate change, where without some form of U.S. and Chinese cooperation, it's going to be very difficult for the international community to begin to come to grips with that huge challenge of climate change and what it means for, our shared planet. Economically, I think, you hear a lot of people in the debate in the United States today who talk about decoupling our economies. It seems to me that it's just impractical to think that, given the deep entanglement of our economies, that's going to be possible. That's what makes the challenge of competition with China so much different than the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the U.S. and Soviet economies were almost entirely separated. I do think, however, that it makes sense, not just for the United States, but you see this on the part of a lot of countries around the world today, to look at ways in which they can sensibly diversify supply chains so that, they reduce their, what is today in some ways an overdependence in certain sensitive sectors on supply chains connected to China. So, I think a smart, hard-nosed diplomacy is going to look at ways in which we're going to have to compete, in which we're going to have frictions, in which, our approach is going to be best grounded in working with allies and partners to magnify our influence in dealing with China. But we're also going to have to work harder to preserve space in those areas where it is going to be crucially important for U.S. and Chinese leaderships to try at least to work together.
You mentioned this idea of retrenchment and state building at home. There is this another movement that seems to be coalescing these days on both the right and the left around the idea of a foreign policy guided by restraint. Just recently, there's the Quincy Institute, which is funded by George Soros and Charles Koch, that sort of epitomizes the bipartisan nature of this movement. Now, in all fairness, it doesn't renounce the idea of American global leadership, but it really emphasizes the use of diplomacy over military force and a much lighter footprint in terms of U.S. Forward basing and global security guarantees and even alliances. Can you have U.S. global leadership the way we imagine it and the way it's been conceived without the military component, without the global security component that the U.S. military provides in terms of, for instance, East Asia and the challenge of China, but also elsewhere?
Well, in my experience, you never get very far in American diplomacy, at least, unless it's backed up by our economic leverage, our military leverage, in better times backed up by the power of our example. Our capacity to overcome some very real problems at home of race and of inequality, but to make strides forward, not toward a perfect union, but at least to deal with some of our imperfections as well. We're losing ground, I think, on many of those fronts today. But what you want to do, it seems to me, is make diplomacy your first tool for disciplined American leadership in the world. We've gotten in bad habits, especially since 9/11, I think, of over-militarizing our diplomacy. That's certainly been true in the Middle East, for example, the part of the world where pessimists always feel right at home and where dysfunctions are going to continue for some time. So we need a much more disciplined approach, I think, to pursuing American interests in the Middle East. We were guilty, over the last few decades of a lot of magical thinking about our transformative powers in some very complicated societies, not just in the Arab world, but across the Middle East as well. And so, in that sense, I think restraint in the use of U.S. military force, beginning to address that inversion of the tools of American national security policy, which prioritized, I think, military and intelligence tools over diplomatic tools. I absolutely agree, and I've argued this for the last few years. It's really important to put greater emphasis on diplomacy, simply because, diplomacy is not always going to fix all problems that the United States faces internationally, but it ought to be our tool of first resort, because in those instances where you can make progress, save enormously in terms of American blood and treasure, and in terms of the damage that's done to other societies as well. You need a strong military to back up your diplomacy. You need a healthy economy. You need the power of example of an American society, which is in such short supply today as we go through so many different difficulties at home in the Trump era. But I think it is really important to pay attention to the importance of discipline, to matching ends to means, to avoiding the kinds of overreach and over-militarization that has gotten us into a lot of trouble in the past.
To the extent that Trump is a symptom more than a cause of what we're seeing in American foreign policy, it seems to me to reflect a certain burden fatigue on the part of the American people and the American public, partly with regard to the wars in the Middle East, but just in general, this idea that America should have an enlightened self-interest, whereas other countries have a simple self-interest. Do you expect the pandemic and the economic fallout from it to exacerbate that kind of public backlash about America's global role, or do you think that it's something that can survive that? And how do you communicate to the American public in order to regenerate a support for that kind of vision in the post-pandemic period?
Well, I think it's the role of leaders to be honest about America's role in the world. Honest in the sense that we have overreached in the past, that we have over-militarized our foreign policy and our approach to diplomacy in many instances. We failed to match ends and means. Most obviously, and I think most tragically, in the war in Iraq in 2003. So when I talk about enlightened self-interest, I'm not talking about some new and expansive view of America's role in the world. What I'm talking about is a careful, disciplined assessment of the international landscape, of our strengths, that obviously puts the health of American society and dealing with all the huge challenges that we face at home today as a first priority, but that sees the reality that, as people often say, smart foreign policy begins at home in a strong economic and political system. I think American leaders need to do a better job than any of us have done in the past of making the case to Americans that smart foreign policy also ends at home, too, in healthier economic opportunities and a healthier environment and better security as well. And that the essence of, employing enlightened self-interest is to see that our interests are going to be best served if we're disciplined about our engagement overseas, that we can't retrench entirely, but nor can we assume that we can, kind of restore the role that, we held uniquely in a way in that first quarter century after the end of the Cold War, that we're going to need in our own self-interest to work with allies and partners and reshape institutions. And that we still, at least as I look out over the next couple of decades, have a better hand to play than any of our major rivals. Again, not just because of our military and economic leverage for all the damage we've done to ourselves, in the course of the mismanagement of this pandemic, but because of our capacity to draw on alliances, invest in coalitions of countries as well. So long as we pay attention to that, then I think it's possible to use that frame of enlightened self-interest to, pursue a more disciplined American leadership role in the world. In my experience, most Americans understand the significance of American engagement in the world. That we can't cut ourselves off from the rest of the world and, defend ourselves or promote the health or the economic possibility in our own society. But that it's, absolutely important for us to be disciplined in how we pursue that. And a lot of Americans today are pretty skeptical about the capacity of people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment, to be disciplined in the way in which we exercise American power and influence overseas, because they've seen too many instances of overreach. And that's what I think we need to guard against.
Ambassador Burns, my final question is not really on the topic of foreign policy. It's something we've been doing at WPR on our Friday editorial calls each week since we started working remotely at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's to try and recreate the camaraderie of working as a team. And each Friday, everyone on the team brings something to share, whether it's a book, fiction or nonfiction, a movie, a TV series, music, recipe, anything that's made social distancing a little more bearable. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you what you would contribute to our list.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. I'm a huge basketball fan, and so I really enjoyed the Netflix series Last Dance about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls basketball team during the 1990s. It was really well done and fun to watch and fun to relive, in a sense, my days as a basketball fan in the 90s, watching Jordan and the Bulls. So, a lot of other viewers across this country and around the world, I thought that was really enjoyable.
I haven't seen it. I've read a lot about it. Those were dark days for the New York Knicks, although it's only gotten darker since then. So maybe it won't be as painful to watch as the present.
I was a big Knicks fan when I lived in New Jersey as a kid back in their glory days, the championship years in the early 70s too. So I'm a big fan of the Knicks in those days, but you're right, they've fallen on a lot harder times since then.
Most people don't really realize that there were championship years.
Well, I'm dating myself, but there were, and they'll come again eventually.
Ambassador Burns, you've been very generous with your time and your insights. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Judah. Thank you.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.